Chapter 64, Transportation, Section 13. To preserve the continuity of this narrative, it may be advisable to give throughout the incidents which relate to Macquarie Harbour. The short but severe government in 1824 of Lieutenant Wright was superseded by Captain Butler in 1825, of whom the common testimony is favourable. Its economical results will be comprehended in that general view of prison labour reserved for the close of this volume. He extended cultivation and thus mitigated the sufferings of the prisoners, and by building ships varied the industry of the men, many of whom went down for punishment but returned skillful mechanics. Of all the thousands professing to bring back its consolation to the wretched, not one minister had been found, perhaps not sought for, to try there the remedies of the gospel. That a Wesleyan missionary ventured entitles him to the esteem of mankind. Governor Arthur suggested and even entreated this direction of missionary labours. He wrote to Joseph Butterworth, MP, and to the Colonial Office, and the Rev. Mr. Schofield was appointed to enter this moral desert. On his arrival in 1829, he heard terrific accounts of the perils of that place. He was told that his labours would be useless and his life sacrificed. He hesitated for a time, but Arthur declared that such a post of danger he, as a soldier, should consider one of honour. Mr. Schofield proved that he was neither deficient in zeal nor prudence. The place prepared for his ministry was, indeed, comfortless. The wind overpowered his voice, and his congregation shivered with cold, but to the men it was a new era. Having discoursed on the advantages of knowledge, 47 prisoners requested instruction, and, assisted by Mr. Commissary Lempriere and countenanced by the commandant, he taught many to read. Captain Butler marked a change in the temper of the men. Punishments fell off one half, several were united with the Wesleyan Society, and on the missionaries' recommendation their stay was shortened. They only should ask the reality of such repentance who have endeavoured to reform the wicked. One man was specially pointed out to Messrs. Backhouse and Walker. The change in his conduct was great, and its effects visible, his demeanour, his countenance, and, said the commandant, his very voice was changed. He had lost his arm by an accident, which nearly deprived him of life. He had formed a cave at the base of the island, reached by a steep, slippery descent. It was here Mr. Backhouse joined him, as he knelt down on the rough floor of his cold cavern to adore the Almighty for granting the privilege of solitude. Strange meeting and strange subject of thanksgiving. Messrs. Backhouse and Walker, of the Society of Friends, travelled these colonies in 1831 to 1836, chiefly engaged in religious labours and principally to admonish the prisoners. The volume, of which Backhouse was the author, attests their industry and accurate observation while performing a mission, which the moral weight of their connections rendered of great moment. To understand this record of their labours, some acquaintance with science is requisite, and not less a knowledge of Quaker modes of thought. The adventurous and buoyant spirit of the writer, which carried him into odd situations, is sometimes irresistibly droll in contrast with formal phrases. He was a gentleman of prudence and sagacity. He lifted up his heart to God, took his pocket compass, and thus escaped some perils, both by sea and land, and carried to England a reputation from which detraction has taken nothing, and which friendship would scarcely desire to improve. The capture of the Cyprus in Recherche Bay on the voyage to Macquarie Harbour was a stirring episode in the history of transportation. It excited vast interest in Great Britain and was dramatised at a London theatre. The prisoners, who wage war with society, regarded the event with exultation, and long after, a song composed by a sympathising poet was propagated by oral tradition and sung in chorus around the fires in the interior. This version of the story made the capture a triumph of the oppressed over their oppressors. The stanzas set forth the sufferings of the prisoners by the cruelty of their masters, who they vainly attempted to please. It related their flight from torture to the woods and drew but a dreary picture of the life of an outlaw. It passed through the details of conviction and embarkation, and then described the dashing seamanship of the pirates in managing the bark, once destined to carry them to that place of suffering, but which bore bold Captain Swallow to the wide ocean and liberty. Such was the song, but the facts were different. In August 1829, 31 prisoners embarked on board the Cyprus. Among them was Swallow, a seaman who 18 years before had cut out a schooner at Port Jackson and was afterwards transported to Van Diemen's Land in the Deveron, Captain Wilson. This man, before he landed, exemplified remarkable courage. A dreadful storm disabled the vessel. The rigging was in fragments. It became necessary to cut away a portion of the wreck, which would probably cost the adventurer his life. The captain called for a volunteer, and all being silent was himself about to ascend, when Swallow, remarking that his own life was of little moment, accomplished the perilous task. Perhaps presuming on this service, he was found secreted on board the Deveron on its homeward voyage and was delivered to the British Admiral at Rio. He, however, escaped, got to London, was retaken and returned to this colony. Several others were capital respites who had been guilty of atrocious crimes. These men were entrusted to the charge of Lieutenant Carew and a guard of 10 soldiers. On board they had provision for 400 men for 6 months, with a scanty supply of water. When he received the prisoners, Lieutenant Carew was warned of their desperate character by the jailer, though not of the precise nature of their crimes. The ammunition supplied was, however, insufficient. 10 rounds each man. To spare the powder, the muskets were not often charged. The berths of the soldiers were below, and the opening only sufficient to emerge unarmed. That of the prisoners was too small to permit their lying down. One opening admitted air, without bars or fastenings, and could not be closed day or night. It was necessary to exercise on deck, and at the time of the capture, the number allowed was exceeded, it is said, by the connivance of the convict sailors. Several of the prisoners had before been relieved of their irons, among the rest, Swallow, the pirate captain. And when the assault commenced, there were 9, and soon after 16 engaged in the fray. There were only 2 sentinels, and 1 other soldier unarmed on deck. Lieutenant Carew had left the vessel to fish, accompanied by the surgeon, the mate, a soldier, and the prisoner Popjoy. A few minutes after, he heard the firing of a musket and hastened towards the vessel. But when he reached her side, she was taken. The struggle with the sentinels seems to have been severe, and one of the soldiers below fired a shot, which passed between the arm of Swallow and his side. The mutineers compelled them to surrender by pouring down water into the hold and threatening to stifle them if resistance were prolonged. They were also in danger of suffocation from their own gunpowder. Carew implored the pirates to give up the vessel and promised oblivion. When attempting to board, they pointed several muskets at his breast. At length, he consented to go ashore with the soldiers and 13 prisoners who refused to share in the adventure, and in all, 45 were landed at different points of the bay. The pirates gave them 1 sheep, a few pieces of beef, 30 pounds of flour, and half a bag of biscuit, with a small quantity of spirit and sugar. And at dawn sailed from the coast. The refusal of a boat cut off all immediate communication with the port and gave time for considerable progress. The Cyprus was without charts, but several of the mutineers were well acquainted with navigation. The sufferings of the party on shore were inexpressible. They distributed 1 quarter of biscuit daily and subsisted chiefly on mussels, found for some time until a spring tide covered them. Morgan and Popjoy set out the next day for Hobart and attempted to cross a river with their garments tied on their backs. They were driven back by the natives and were obliged to return, having lost their clothes. 5 men started to head the Huon and thus reach Hobart, and were saved from starvation only by the party sent down to meet them. Morgan and Popjoy, under the direction of Carew, and encouraged by his lady, who displayed extraordinary fortitude, constructed a coracle of wicker work, about 12 feet long, formed of the wattle. They covered it with hammock cloth, and overlaid it with boiled soap and resin mingled, which they happened to possess. In this frail bark they boldly ventured to sea, and, notwithstanding a strong south breeze, happily found the Aurelia at Partridge Island, 20 miles distant. Contrary winds had compelled that vessel to put back to the island, and boats were instantly forwarded to the relief of the sufferers, who for 2 days had been without sustenance. Though several had received severe contusions in the capture, and experienced much privation during the 13 days' detention, no life was lost. The circumstances attending the capture were subject to the investigation of a court-martial. Lieutenant Carew was charged with neglecting the proper precautions, Though warned of the extreme peril which demanded his vigilance, that he proceeded on a fishing excursion, that during his absence the vessel was surprised and seized, that he exhibited professional incapacity and had been guilty of a breach of the Articles of War. This trial lasted 5 days and was fully reported. The evidence is conflicting, and especially respecting those incidents which were supposed to suggest the capture to the prisoners, such as the neglect of the firearms and the indulgence of the prisoners by a removal of their irons and their access to the deck. On the other hand, the testimony was positive and multiplied, that Carew had guarded the prisoners with great steadiness and rigor, that he apprehended no danger was certain, his wife and children were aboard, but he forgot that the desire of liberty makes men quick and desperate, and that they who had the miseries of Macquarie Harbour before them made light of life. The arrangements of the vessel did not, however, admit of proper precautions. When 2 of these men, in company with 16 other prisoners, were sent down 3 years after to the penal settlement, there were 10 soldiers to guard them. 2 only were on deck at once. Their prison was railed in and closed down with triple bolts. The sentinels were doubled, and some sat continually in sight of the prisoners. The pirates proceeded to the Friendly Islands, and thence to the islands of the Japanese, where 7 deserted and the rest passed towards China. 4 seamen presented themselves in a boat, having Edward on the stern, to a vessel at Whampoa, and stated that they had belonged to a lost ship of that name. Swallow was one of them. He was examined by the Committee of Supercargoes at Canton and produced a sextant on which was the name of Waldron, of the Edward. This name Swallow assumed and said that he was captain of the Edward, of Durham, related his voyages to various ports of South America, the Sandwich Islands, and Japan. Compelled to abandon his vessel, injured by the fire of the Japanese, the crew had divided into parties, of which himself and companions were one. This deposition was forwarded to the company's secretary, and passages were given free to Swallow and 3 others. A few days after he had sailed, 4 more appeared. Davis, who gave his name as Stanley, was examined, but he had forgotten the assumed name of the captain and called him Wilson. This led to minuter inquiries, and he was sent home a prisoner. Information was instantly forwarded and reached England before Swallow arrived with his companions, and a warrant was issued for their detention. The 3 were taken, but Swallow had left the ship at Margate, and for a time escaped. Watts, Davis, and Swallow were ultimately tried for this offence by the Admiralty Court in London. The 2 first were executed, and Swallow was acquitted. It is said that the proof of his participation, except by compulsion, was incomplete. The events which led to their conviction were curiously coincident. The Thames police magistrate was unable to proceed, and they might have been discharged, but the police clerk had studied the hue and cry and was struck with their resemblance to the description. Popjoy, now in England, pardoned for his good conduct at the capture, had been recently before the magistrate for some trifling offence, and to interest his worship had given the story of the capture, the coracle, and all incidents of his intrepidity. He was thus soon found out by the police and gave full proof of identity. He stated their crimes, their names, and secret marks which were discovered on their persons. One of them, the very day of the capture, had the figure of a mermaid punctured on his arm. Mr. Capon, the jailer of Hobart Town, was in London, and thus was able to supply important particulars. Several were forwarded to Van Diemen's Land and tried by Judge Pedder. They pleaded that their concurrence was involuntary. The chief question was the actual position of the vessel, whether or not on the high seas. The military jury were not disposed to hesitate on this point, and when asked repeatedly whether they found a place shut in between 2 heads, the high seas, they answered without hesitation, "We do." Only John Cam suffered death in Van Diemen's Land. Robert Maguire was tried last. For this offence, in the scuffle he wounded a soldier who had attempted to strike him and whose testimony was decisive. He stood sentry with a military crossbelt and bayonet fixed, and was recollected by his refusal of liquor, which he warned his comrades would prove their destruction. The chief advantage of Macquarie Harbour was its total isolation, but the opening of the country from the Derwent to the Gordon destroyed this seclusion. The bar, gradually rising, became more dangerous. The place was too distant for supervision or supply. Its barren soil allowed no variety of labour or produce. The decaying buildings were of little worth. There was nothing removable except the doors and windows. These were shipped on board the Frederick of 100 tons, and all being ready for sea, on the 11th January, 1834, Mr. Torr, the pilot, as captain, embarked with the master shipwright, Mr. Hoy, the mate, 10 prisoners of the Crown, and a corporal's guard. They were detained by adverse winds, and the pilot allowed the prisoners to land to wash their clothing, all except one. They returned with great apparent cheerfulness. 2 of the soldiers were permitted to fish near a neighbouring rock, and thus only 2 remained on board, while one of these, allured into the forecastle, listened to the singing of a convict. The prisoners on deck handed out the arms. Messrs. Hoy and Torr endeavoured to recover possession, both by persuasion and force. There was a short scuffle, and shots were fired. The balls passed near the gentlemen in the cabin, though they were not injured. Remonstrance being useless, they surrendered, and with the soldiers now recalled from the rock, were sent on shore. Thus, although the military and civil officers were nearly equal in number, the mutineers accomplished their purpose without loss of life. They sent next day a quantity of provisions, small in amount, but considering the voyage before them, more than such men could have been expected to spare. The soldiers, gratified by their fairness, forgot their own position in sympathy for the liberated men and gave them cheers and good wishes. On the morning after, the wind became fair, and a light breeze carried them beyond danger. When the mutineers had gained possession of the ship, John Barker, a mariner, was chosen captain. He could take an observation and direct a ship's course. His mate was John Fair, and several others were sailors. By carrying too much canvas, they strained the vessel, which required their constant efforts at the pump. They proposed to run to Valdavia, South America. They suffered from a gale of wind of 9 days' duration, which they weathered with great difficulty, and saw land on the 26th of February, having been 6 weeks on their passage. They resolved to abandon the brig. They had 3 carpenters on board, by whom the launch was decked and rigged, and they left the Frederick with her channel plates under water. Having landed, they discovered an Indian ploughing with a wooden share. From him they could not obtain supplies. They, however, found that they were in the neighbourhood of Valdavia, and soon approached the battery of that port and were humanely received by the inhabitants. On examination, they declared the entire facts of their escape and were allowed to reside under promises of protection. They appealed to the officials as patriots and implored them to take their lives rather than to restore them to the British. A few months after, HMS Blonde Commodore Mason excited their alarm. It, however, passed over, several married, and the governor and his lady honoured the nuptials of the pirate captain with their presence. Shortly after, they were put under friendly arrest, Commodore Mason having applied for them and made some preparations to seize them by force, sending an armed boat, which the Americans repelled. The second governor was not equally favourable, but was conciliated by the promise of Barker and 3 others to build him a boat. This accomplished, they seized her and absconded. The governor, exasperated at the loss, and their perfidy, probably excited by his harsh treatment and their constant apprehension of capture, arrested and delivered up their companions to the Blonde, who were sent first to England and then to Van Diemen's Land. They were tried in 1837. One of their number raised an objection, which was referred to the English judges and decided in their favour. The defence was very ingenious. Admitting the vessel was taken, it had never been finished, it belonged to no port. It had received no name. It was canvas, rope, boarding, and treenails, put together shipwise. Yet it was not a legal ship. The seizure might be theft, but not piracy. Upon the whole, the prisoners conducted themselves well. However criminal the escape, their kindness to the people they overpowered, their unusual unanimity and prudent acknowledgment of their real circumstances, their appeal to the patriots for sympathy, and the ingenuity of their defence must be admitted as exhibiting qualities by no means despicable. But never was the government more culpable, or the prisoners less so, than in the instance of the Badger, a vessel of 25 tons, freighted with provisions for the East Bay Neck military station in 1833. She was a fast sailor and well found, and in charge of a master mariner, a convict, and convict seamen. The escape was joined and probably planned by Darby, later lieutenant in the Royal Navy and present at the Battle of Navarino, a man of small stature but great daring. On his passage to the colony, he had been implicated in a plot to take the vessel, which was partly known to a notorious receiver on board, who expected some favor by informing. The plotters intended to shut down the soldiers and officer to run for the American coast, and there allow those who thought proper to land or to attend the vessel to her destination. Darby declared that buried on the shores of America, he had considerable treasure. On his arrival in Van Diemen's Land, the affair on board was made known to the governor, by whom Darby was told that if ever he attempted to abscond or to enlist others in the enterprise, he should suffer all the law could inflict. He was, however, placed at the signal station and afterwards appointed to assist the water bailiff, and thus had always in view the means of escape. A convict clergyman, employed as tutor by a member of council, was the companion of his flight. The loss of this vessel exemplified the laxity of official oversight where most required. No one could be surprised at the escape, which good men suffering in a good cause would have naturally ascribed to the favor of Providence. End of chapter 64, Being Transportation, section 13.